Hello, Psychology of Motivation. Guess what? We have, at this point in time, crossed the halfway point. I count 16 lectures. Lecture 16 is basically a review, so call it 15. This is lecture 9, so we have crossed the halfway point. How about that? And Penelope is here to celebrate this momentous occasion with us. We are going to talk about personal control beliefs, and embedded in this one is a discussion board. So we will describe what's necessary for that assignment as we get to that point. So personal control beliefs, well, the locus of control, or perceived locus of control, the PLOC, LOC, basically synonymous for our purposes. The locus of control is an individual's sense of where his or her life influences generate. So basically, you know, are you in charge of your outcomes, or do outcomes just kind of come at you by chance, right? So internal locus of control is really defined as I am the master of my universe. Right? I'm the one who calls the shots. The benefit is I get the credit when something goes well. When I do something well, I can say, look, I did it. But the downside is if I mess up, then I have to take responsibility for it. So this internal locus of control, right, the life outcomes originate largely within me. Now, it can be external, and of course, this is a continuum. So no one is absolutely purely internal or purely external. Well, I shouldn't say that. Maybe there is, but most of us, you know, kind of are probably somewhere in the middle of the distribution. But external people are basically the people who put the shit happens bumper sticker on their car. Shit happens, right? And I don't know what to say, you know, shit happens, or God, you know, the fortune was not smiling upon me, or some people are lucky and I'm not one of those people. So they often offer excuses that reference forces that they believe to be outside of their control. So again, externals, shit happens, right? Internals, I make shit happen. And that's the big difference. Now, what are some of the factors that influence this? Well, our motivation to exercise personal control can come in part from our expectations, or expectancies, if you will. It's a subjective estimate of how likely an event is to occur. Now, there can be efficacy expectations, and that surrounds my abilities. Outcome expectations are achieving the goal. Motivation to exercise personal control is actually kind of both of those combined. So these two kinds of expectancy, we have the person, all right? Can I do it? And this is the expectation of being able to enact the behaviors one needs in order to cope effectively with the situation at hand, or perhaps not cope, but excel with the situation at hand. We commit the behavior, right? And so I will commit the behavior if I believe that I can commit the behavior. Penelope, are you just tearing the place apart here, huh, sweetie? All right. Now, whether the outcome occurs or not is my belief about the behavior itself. So expectations that one behavior will produce positive outcomes or prevent negative outcomes, depending on which way we're looking at it. So there's really two expectancy pieces to the puzzle. Can I do it? And if I do it, will it work? Right? Now, Vroom extends this just a tad, right? And Vroom comes to us from an organizational point of view, right, rather than a into personality psychology point of view. So he paints it the same equation as kind of a three-piece puzzle. The expectancy then is the effort. Will my effort lead to high performance, right? And then if my effort will lead to high performance, the second question is the instrumentality. Will the performance lead to the outcomes? And note that this is very much what we were talking about on the previous slide. But now Vroom adds this third, and I think it's an important component. Judge for yourself. Will I find the outcome desirable? That is, will this cause something to happen that I want to happen? That's the valence, the rewards, right, as positive or negative. Maybe the outcome will be negative, you know, maybe it'll be positive. And this is also might be discussed in other terms as the incentive value of the activity, right? So, perceived control then of the self, the action, and control. The self, the agentic self, that's us. through our efficacy expectations delivers the action, and then the action should lead to the outcome, and so the self-action and control, this is the model, the control model of perceived control. Control over the outcome, though, is the combination of the expectation that the outcome can occur with the necessary effort which I'm capable of doing being applied. Okay, so it's a bunch of different ways to kind of state the same thing. There's really two belief systems at work, though. Can I do it? And if I do it, will the outcome realize? Okay, and then of course with Vroom, it's the third component. Do I even care that it happens? That is it desirable, the outcome that is? Now, let's go to a very simple term that most of you are going to be psychology majors, and even those who are not, if you've had Psych 1100 or social psychology or the excellent class on the self, right, here at Ohio State. Self-efficacy is one's judgment of how well or poorly one will cope with a situation given the skills that one possesses and the circumstances at large, right? So it's like, am I up to the task? These are my skills, but those skills, even though I possess these skills, might not be enough to accomplish the task, right? So self-efficacy is the belief that we're good on both. It's the generative capacity in which the performer improvises a way to best translate the personal abilities into effective performance. So it's a belief in oneself, but more than that, just not the general self, but the belief that one can do. It is the can-do attitude. So self-efficacy is the belief in one's capabilities to organize and execute the source of action required to manage prospective situations. And this comes to us from Dr. Bandura, Albert Bandura, of tremendous social learning fame among many other aspects of social psychology. So what are the sources then and effects of self-efficacy? Well, personal behavior history tells us a lot about what we should be capable to do in the future. So my past performances, right, provide feedback, and that's something we discussed in the last lecture, on how likely I am to perform in the future. Now, vicarious experience is another way to get at this, and this is, that simple statement, well, if he can do it, I can do it. Right? So this I determine vicariously. I observe someone else succeed, and I believe myself to be equal or superior to that person, then I should be able to succeed as well. And then verbal persuasion. How many of you guys do this? Pep talk. Hey, you got this. You can do this, right? So to the extent that you engage in that verbal persuasion, it can bolster your self-efficacy beliefs. And then your physiological activity, that is your actual physiological state, involves, because notice that some days we say, under normal circumstances, this would be a piece of cake, but my ass is dragging today, or I'm sick, and I don't think I'm up to the performance, right? So a lot of it affecting our current state as well, physiologically speaking. Now, that's the extent of the self-efficacy, but what is the outcome, right? What is the payoff here? Well, choice. And this can be grossly divided into approach versus avoidance. So if my expectations are low, my self-efficacy is not all it could be, then avoidance of the task might be my choice as a result of the perception of my lack of self-efficacy. Effort and persistence. Why should I continue to do this if I don't believe I can do it? So notice that persistence can be eroded by a lack of self-efficacy. Or we might sandbag, it's like, oh my God, I don't even, yeah, okay, I got to do it, but I'm not, my heart isn't in it, and neither is my effort, right? The thinking and decision making, what we choose to do and how we think about it, right, is also part of this self-efficacy outcome. And then emotional reactions, the stress and anxiety, right? To the extent that I don't believe that I can do it, then that may cause me stress or cause me anxiety in the face of this challenge. So, again from Bandura, people's level of motivation, their affective states, and remember affect is loosely synonymous with emotion, depending on who you're talking to. And actions are based more on what they believe than on what is objectively the case. So if you believe you can do it, that's half the battle to getting it done, right? But now, if it's a legitimate belief. So, how about this guy? There is some self-efficacy there. There is some confidence in the self, right? So, and we know that self-efficacy, that high self-efficacy, is often synonymous with confidence. And don't you just envy some of those people who look just absolutely insanely confident? I was always impressed with my mom. I thought that was one of my mom's defining characteristics or qualities, was her confidence. She had times of self-doubt, but for the most part she was confident, immensely confident. And that's what I think allowed her to become an executive as she did, because she was confident, right, in her abilities. And, towards the later end of her career, she negotiated an awful lot for herself when she stopped working for CBS, the studio, and went independent. She developed that required a high level of self-efficacy and a high level of confidence that she could make it as such, right? So I'll say this about my mom. When she landed her job at Disney and she started doing work for Disney, she was the first female executive to enter into Disney's executive lunchroom. How about that, huh? But it's that confidence, and it's something that we can build, but it comes out of self-efficacy, as we described earlier. Now let's talk empowerment. And empowerment is a strange word. I think it's a word that's overused and probably misused to a certain extent, and has a kind of ironic quality to it. And we'll get to that a little bit here as we move on. It involves a process possessing the knowledge, the skills, beliefs that allow people to exert control over their lives. So a lot of the context for empowerment, as we hear it used now, is we empower employees. We empower these people. We empower, women. We empower these folks. And I don't know that it's well used in that context, perhaps. Do we provide the knowledge that people need? Do we provide people the opportunity to acquire the knowledge they need? Do we help them practice so that they can gain the feedback on their performances that builds legitimate self-efficacy beliefs, right? It's no good for someone to believe they can do something when they can't, and then they try it. It's almost better that they hadn't tried in the first place than to bullshit people into thinking that they can do it when you kind of know that they can't, right? Or the odds are they can't. So empowerment is a tricky concept. And skills. And a lot of this comes out of training. And a lot of organizations are really poor at training employees. And then, therefore, the employees don't develop the requisite skills and are essentially maybe thought to be empowered when they actually aren't. So empowering people, the mastery modeling program, and now remember we're looking at the difference between performance and mastery. The expert identifies component skills that are involved in effective coping and measures novices' efficacy expectations on each component skill. So we break a task down into multiple component skills, and through training, through helping, we build the sense of efficacy for each of those. The expert models each component skill, emphasizing the novice's most worrisome skill areas. So this is where you're at, but let's see how it's done. Novices emulate each modeled skill. Expert then provides corrective feedback as needed. So you can see this is a very intense and very tightly orchestrated training program. Novices can then integrate the separate component skills into the overall simulated performance, right? So build with the pieces, and then the next step is to assemble those pieces into the whole, right? So you help the novices integrate the different skill components into the coherent overall performance. Novices participate in cooperative learning groups. A person gives a simulated performance while peers watch. As they watch, they provide encouragement. You got this, right? And tips. It might help if you consider doing this. Each person takes a turn until everyone has performed multiple times. And then novices perform individually in near naturalistic situation, and it features numerous and realistic difficulties, obstacles, setbacks, while the expert provides modeling and corrective feedback to overcome those setbacks and obstacles. And then the expert models confident demeanor and arousal regulating techniques. That is, we possess the ability to chill out and not wig out, if you will. To me, this is a lot like my experience in graduate school. When I came to graduate school, I mean, you know, in 99, I showed up in July of 99. I started early before fall. And it's like, oh my God, these people are so smart. Oh my God, I am never going to be able to manage this. This is just crazy. They know everything and they know how to do everything. But we start taking a class. So we take a class in research methods with Marilyn Brewer, right? We take a class in meta-analysis with another professor. We take all these different classes, a stats class. Most of us majored in stats in the social psychology program. Quantitative psychology, they called it. So, but every step of the way, we're building these component skills. And what does this eventually lead us to do? Well, it allows us then to survey the literature, find gaps in the literature that represent opportunities. We generate hypotheses. We build those hypotheses into experimental designs. We run the experiments. We collect the data. We analyze the data. Right? And when significant, then we write a research article or prepare a research presentation. Notice, that is a whole bunch of different skills that we learned separately, and then over time we integrate. And we had research labs where we meet every week and we present research ideas, or we present completed research or ongoing research, and people critique. So it's the Mastery Modeling Program. And the ultimate goal coming out of Ohio State's Social Psychology Graduate Program was to become a qualified researcher and land a job at an R1, a research institution, another institution, let's say like Ohio State, right? So it's the step-by-step to master the process. So the mastery, to the extent that the perceived control one has over attaining the desirable outcomes and preventing aversive ones. So I watch many of my colleagues who went the research route, like Maddox, like Rucker. These people were publishing maniacs, right? And they paid attention in graduate school. They developed a high level of skill in writing and conducting experiments and asking the right research questions, defending those ideas at conferences. And so they learned the business from the inside out, and then believed as they left that they could go get that job in the R1 institution, set up their own research lab, bring in their own graduate students, and do the deal, basically. Build a career out of it, right? Others of us, a handful of us, in going through this process says, yeah, we could do this, but it wasn't necessarily desirable. And this is where we get Vroom's idea of incentive. Let's return to that. It wasn't really maybe what we were looking for, that maybe we couldn't see ourselves doing this in the long term. And I had a different path because they started me teaching at the beginning of my third year. And that's what I really enjoyed. So I built a different skill set. But notice, it is, in fact, a multi-component task to teach, but we learn each of the skills separately, and then we begin to integrate them through practice. And for many folks, they start as course assistants, right, and then move up the ladder that way. I, on the other hand, and a couple of us, were thrown straight into the teaching pool and learned that way. But it's about mastery, and it's about developing one's craft, so to speak, to use an old kind of saying. So, now educational mastery, since we're talking about teaching, that is, how do I know that my students are mastering the material? And this becomes, this has been a question that has been asked for probably thousands of years. We can go probably all the way back to Aristotle and Plato talking to their students, and how do I know that they've mastered the concepts or the ideas? Now, when we think of mastery and assessing mastery within an educational environment, the name that comes to mind is Bloom. And the overall model, before we get to the more specific model, is we might give some instruction, right, and then we give a quiz, and mastery is demonstrated, or non-mastery and relationships and correctives, and then we retest. So one of the purposes of testing was thought to be, can we verify that the student has mastered the material? And if so, if they have mastered the material, then we will move on to new material. If they haven't mastered the material, then we should acquaint the student with the material until they do achieve mastery, right? And that was the general idea. Now we know that's not necessarily how it works in the real world. Many people are promoted to the next grade without having mastered the material in the previous grade. Now Bloom lays it out in the way of assessing the level of mastery, and he says there's different levels of what we call mastery. And on a multiple choice test, as we started looking at our final exam at Columbus State for Psych 1100, when I first arrived at Columbus State, I'm looking at 70, 80 sections of Psych 1100 that are being taught every quarter. I was on the quarter system then. And I looked at the data, and the class-by-class performance varied tremendously. We saw classes that had D averages on their final exam. We saw classes that had A averages on their final exam and everything in between. And the inconsistency was striking. And I suggested at this point that what we probably should do for Psych 1100 is have a single final exam that is given to all sections. And what this will allow us to do is to be able to compare between sections, and not that I said this outwardly to very loudly, but it allows us to, in a certain extent, to assess teacher performance. Because if we have a teacher who is consistently having sections that average C or D on a final exam, and we have other teachers with the same final exam that are have B or A averages from their class, we might surmise or draw from that someone is teaching more effectively, that their students are mastering the material to a greater extent. Now, there's obviously qualifications to that. But one thing we did in developing a standardized test then, we said, how difficult should each question be? What does the question allow the student to demonstrate? And we use Bloom's taxonomy, his level. Now, the lower order, does someone know it? So could they recognize the correct answer of 4 options to a question? And that would demonstrate that they know the material, right? But just knowing it could be the result of rote memory, right? That I just memorized these, so I know that this belongs to this. And it doesn't necessarily understand any kind of comprehension, which Bloom thought was the next level. So what we would do is, we're writing questions for the exam, we would also rate the question. Does this test a student's knowledge? And then stop there. Does this test a student's comprehension? Does it stop there? But the higher order learning, which really kind of indicates mastery rather than simply memorization or understanding, is their ability to apply the material. So application questions then are more sophisticated, and the response chosen demonstrates an appropriate application of the concept to the situation in the question. And then the 4th level is analysis, and often analysis is a comparison. So which is the better answer, or which theory best applies? And this requires then even that higher level of thinking, analysis. Now, for most lower level courses, that's where it stops, is with these 4 levels of Bloom taxonomy. When we get into, let's say, 4,000, 3,000, 4,000 level classes, we may begin to see synthesis and evaluation as higher level thinking components. Certainly in graduate school, then most of the focus is going to be on those. But the deal is, excuse me, that we are capable of assessing test in a way that demonstrates student mastery. Okay? Questions about that? And aren't you happy? I sometimes for this class I have an assignment exploiting Bloom's taxonomy, but not for this semester. So if that makes you happy, then you can thank me if you will. Okay, let's talk coping. So ways of coping. All right. So what's a way of coping? One is approach versus avoidance. Hannah, what are you breaking over there? I don't even want to know. So, taking action by moving toward and interacting with the problem versus walking away from the problem. So, ways of coping? Well, I can approach or I can avoid, right? Social versus solitary. I can take action with a teammate or a partner versus acting alone. Well, ways of coping, proactive or reactive. And we talked a lot about proactive versus reactive in the last lecture, right? In lecture 8. So, direct versus indirect. We can take action oneself versus enlisting the help of an intermediary who takes the direct action on our behalf. Another way of coping is control versus escape. This is taking charge, right, of the situation, or staying clear of the situation. And these are all legitimate ways of coping, right? We might then evaluate some as more masterful than others, since mastery has been part of our conversation. Alloplastic versus autoplastic. There's two words that we probably don't use in everyday conversation. Alloplastic is to take action to change the problem, that is the environment, versus taking action to change oneself. And this is often a very important distinction, and unfortunately this is something that we often have to learn through experience. And this is that silly idea of wisdom as you age. Well, some people gain wisdom as they age. We know that others don't, right? But being wise enough to know, hey, I can change this situation, or I don't know that this situation is changeable. I better change my response or my evaluation of it. And note how this is also problem versus focused emotion coping is very similar to this. Taking action to manage the problem causing the stress versus regulating one's emotional response to the problem. So it's kind of like a subcomponent of that. Electron, what are we doing? No, we cannot eat that. All right. Sorry about that, guys. Where are we going to put this? Let's put this here for now. All right. So go find something to do, Electron. You might even listen to me. I don't know. Let us discuss irrational beliefs then. And if we're talking irrational beliefs, the go-to guy is Albert Ellis. So there he is, and he brings to us the ABC approach, and we're dangerously close to our homework assignment. So Ellis believes our response to events and our subsequent levels of stress are due to our beliefs about these events. So beliefs are central to Ellis's therapeutic interventions. That is, changing the events is perhaps unlikely, but changing one's belief about the events and what those events mean is within the control of the client. So, the ABC then, the irrational beliefs can lead to higher levels of stress. And basically what we're saying in a very cliche sense is we are our own worst enemy. That often life appears to really suck, not so much because life sucks, but because we believe it sucks. That it's the belief system that's causing the response. So rational beliefs then, and the ABC model, well, we probably need an ABC, and there you go. A is the acting event. This is the stimuli in the environment, right? Beliefs are what it means. And the consequences then are the result of those beliefs. Consequences change the beliefs, change the perception of the consequence, right? So we might, for example, take a test and say, oh my God, I got a C on the test, my life is over. I'll never get into graduate school, I'm a failure, I might as well just go find a French fry machine to operate for the rest of my life and call it good. This catastrophic interpretation of the events. And it's like, there's other beliefs. If I get a low grade on a test, I get a C on a test, and I say, wow, boy, that is not what I wanted. It's not what I'm looking for. But, it's not the end of the world. So is it the end of the world, or is it not the end of the world? And that's where the belief system operates. But I think we need to spend a little time with Ellis. I think you'll enjoy his style. He is really an outspoken guy, so prepare yourself.
You are probably most widely noted for introducing into the field of psychotherapy an idea that seems almost self-evident, which is that our behavior, our being, ourselves, are affected by our philosophies, by what we think.
Right. And also, conversely, I introduced many years ago, when I first formed RET, Rational Motive Therapy, the idea that our thinking is also affected by our behavior and our feelings.
Mm-hmm. So in effect, it's all one system.
That's right. Interactional.
Mm-hmm. And that system can therefore obviously be affected by dealing with any part of it, I would assume, behavior, emotions, or cognition or thoughts.
Right, but profoundly, if you profoundly change your philosophy, your thinking, then you're more likely, in all probability, to profoundly change your feeling and your behavior, especially your disturbed feeling and your disturbed behavior.
And you drew on the ancient philosophers and sort of coming to the notion that philosophy itself could be a form of psychotherapy. At that point, you broke away from psychoanalysis and developed a form of cognitive therapy.
Yes, I practiced and was a psychoanalyst for a while, but then I discovered that it didn't work, and I have a gene for efficiency, while poor Sigmund Freud had a gene for inefficiency. So I went back to my hobby since the age of 16, philosophy, the philosophy of the ancients, largely of Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius, and in the East of Confucius and Lao Tse and Buddha, and amalgamated it with behavior therapy, which I had used on myself at the age of 19 to get myself over my phobia of public speaking and of approaching young females.
Mm-hmm. Well, if I could get to the kernel of your thought, it is basically that whatever happens to us in life, it's not totally responsible for our emotions.
Right. It contributes to it. A, activating events contribute to C, consequences in our gut, but it's B, our belief system, our philosophy, which mainly, largely, or certainly in great part, makes us feel and think the way we do, especially think and, I should say, behave the way we do, especially in a disturbed manner. We disturb ourselves.
And typically, I suppose, when a person is very angry or very depressed, they almost always think that it's something outside that's causing that.
Right. And we normally, and I think biologically, tend to think that because, see, consequences, my anger immediately follows you are treating me unfairly, that you made me angry instead of you made me feel sorry and regretful to some degree, but my anger I added by commanding and demanding that you not do what you indubitably did.
And in a sense, if I'm right, you broke with Freud in suggesting that the parents aren't responsible, early upbringing isn't responsible, that we teach ourselves these kinds of neurotic behaviors.
Right. We're born gullible to our parents, influenceable, teachable in the first place. Therefore, we stupidly listen to our parents, but then we invent many must, shoulds, ought, demand, command, in addition to the standards, the values that we adopt from our parents. But the standards don't upset us. We mainly upset ourselves with those Jehovian commands.
Yeah. You've used the term, I think you must have coined it, masturbation.
Right. That masturbation is good and delicious, but masturbation is evil and pernicious, is one of my sayings.
And masturbation is when we tell ourselves, I must do this, or things must be this way, even though they're not.
Right. The three main musts are, I must do well, or I'm no good. You louse, must treat me well, or you're worthless and deserve to roast in hell. And the world must give me exactly what I want, precisely when I want it, or it's a horrible, awful place.
It would be awful.
It would be terrible. Right. Because of the must. If you didn't masturbate, then you wouldn't awfulize, terribilize, catastrophize, say, I can't stand it, and put yourself down. If you're only stuck with, I'd like very much to do well, but I never have to, then you wouldn't then disturb yourself.
So the technique that you get engaged in with your clients is one of disputing their musts, their ideas, and showing them that logically, scientifically, philosophically, things are not that way, that nothing must be if it isn't.
The technique is a scientific method, and we say, and we're the only cognitive behavioral therapy which does say, that when you think anti-scientifically, devoutly, really piously, dogmatically, which is inflexible, anti-scientific, then you disturb yourself. Therefore, we use the flexible scientific method to get you philosophically and otherwise to undisturb yourself.
Now, many people, I think particularly the Freudian school of therapy, would suggest that simply being told by your therapist that you're thinking things wrong isn't going to make a bit of difference, that you'll continue with the same old behaviors anyway.
And we would agree that being told it or told where you got it, which you didn't get it from your sacred mother and father, won't help you. But the insight that I made myself disturbed, I foolishly listened to my mother and father and took them too seriously, and I'm still doing it, and that now I require work and practice to give up my biological and sociological tendency to disturb myself. That will help you, not the belief that I disturb myself and that I don't have to. That'll help, but not that much.
Yeah. Well, doesn't the idea that if you can simply change your philosophy, that your whole behavior will change, somehow go against the behaviorist concept or the materialist notion that the mind doesn't really influence matter? In effect, you're saying that our mind will influence
very significantly, but we also say that since you worked at this foolish philosophy, ingrained it in yourself, conditioned yourself, that therefore it requires work and practice to give it up, and it requires feeling against it. So we always use cognitive thinking and emotive, dramatic, evocative, and behavioral techniques to get people comprehensively to change and to stay changed.
In effect, what you say is that every emotional state has its concomitant belief system.
Right. That even sorrow and regret, which would be appropriate emotions when you're not getting what you want, have the belief system, it's too bad, isn't it unfortunate, while horror and depression is awful, and it must not be this way, and I can't bear it. So, and each of the negative self-defeating states, such as depression or anxiety or despair or rage, has some individual difference in what you tell yourself, what you believe philosophically.
So, in a sense, the heart of your philosophical approach then is to distinguish between what we might call appropriate philosophies, appropriate emotions, and inappropriate ones.
And oddly enough, I discovered after years of doing rational emotive therapy, RET, that there only are a few differences, and one main difference, and it's crucial, is taking a preference, a desire, a goal, a value, practically all of which are legitimate, and escalating it again, transmuting it into a demand, a should, an ought, a must, an absolute.
In other words, the most terrible thing could happen to me. Perhaps I have leprosy.
Right.
Or some kind of a fatal disease, or I think, as you pointed out, maybe somebody is slowly torturing me to death.
Right.
And that doesn't necessarily justify me going into a state of a depression.
Or of horror.
Or of horror.
But it does justify you saying, I don't like this, I wish it weren't so, what am I going to do about it? Which you won't do if you're horrified. You'll freeze and make yourself worse. So you control largely, not completely, your emotional destiny and your behavioral destiny, and if you change your basic philosophy of life, then you can change it. You have the power to do so, but you normally sit on your rump and don't use that power.
So, Albert Ellis in an amazing interview. God, what do you guys think? beyond the idea that Ellis makes up more words than any other person on the planet, but they're words that mean a great deal. But what we get to is, look, something happens, and it produces these consequences. In the middle is our beliefs, and it's our beliefs which then tell us or form our reaction towards the consequences. Change the belief, change our relationship with the consequences, change our relationship with the activating event. So this is the philosophy part. Do you believe that you're entitled to everything you want? Do you believe that you're entitled to throw a tantrum if someone gives you news that you didn't want to hear? If you believe those are appropriate responses, then you will commit those responses, in relation to those activating events, and you will reap those consequences that follow logically from those beliefs. So rational emotive therapy is getting in and attacking the belief system through the 3 pillars that he discusses. Now, I'm not a clinical psychologist, so I don't want to go that far with it. But what I do know is that we do have the power to think differently. And often, especially with relatively minor to moderate problems, and not, severe psychopathology. I don't even want to go there because I'm a social psychologist, not a clinician. But when we're talking about minor to moderate life challenges, changing our belief system is key to changing our relationship with those consequences. So from this, the discussion board 2, this is going to be an individual discussion board. It doesn't require a response. It's just a single post, right? Let's look at the rationale, and then I'll come at you with the instructions. And again, this is a mashup. So the previous, we're on slide 21, the previous 18, 19 slides, 20 slides, how many, really kind of mash them together, hopefully, to form this assignment. So we love to bandy about the term empowerment. And let me take the position for this assignment, because I always entertain multiple perspectives, but let me take the position for this assignment that I'm not a fan of the term. Okay? Consider that empowerment is often thought of something that is done for us, that is made available to us, and that ultimately comes from outside of us. The interpretation of empowerment creates an image, a loss of personal control. And to me, that was the irony that I mentioned earlier. I'm empowered, but if I'm waiting to be empowered by others, then it really is not augmenting my sense of personal control. It's just saying to other people, boy, I wish you would craft a situation where I had more control. And it's like, no, I believe empowerment is largely up to us. That's not that environments aren't supportive of self-empowerment or not. That's something entirely different. So where does all this leave us? As we move through Lecture 9, Personal Control Beliefs, we discuss empowerment, self-efficacy, mastery, and coming up, helplessness. I'm especially fond of Albert Ellis's ABC model. For Ellis, beliefs rise to a most prominent position in our relationship with our assessment of consequences and what those consequences ultimately mean to us. So it really is beliefs that are the kind of the star of that. So we have an assignment on that very topic in Psychology of Adjustment, because we look at the ABC model there, and if you were in Psych of Adjustment, you probably remember it, maybe not. Another course you might want to take if you haven't already. So another shameless self-promotion, always advertising, right? When I first started teaching, especially a lot of new courses at Ohio State, I would put flyers all over campus. I mean, every building where there's a bulletin board, I'd put a flyer and with the description of the class and take this class, etc., to drum up business, right? Yeah, I know. All right, never mind. So, what about a bit of a mashup? 3 questions for you to answer. Consider, number 1, an activating event that leads to a negative catastrophic consequence. What is the belief that is at the source of the negative catastrophic evaluation? For example, I work with some folks that believe anything less than perfect in course design is a failure and reflects horribly on them. Imagine approaching your work that way. That is, imagine redesigning a couple courses because there's a pandemic and you got to change this shit to online, and you're some kind of crazy perfectionist that believes the B in the center of the model, that anything short of perfection is a catastrophe and makes you look like an idiot. What a horrible circumstance to live one's life. What a horrible way to understand one's relationship to their work, right? So the belief, though, that it has to be perfect or it represents a failure can be devastating to a person and their emotional state, as Ellis was talking about. In my situation, you know, we saw maybe, I don't know if it was this lecture, the last lecture, right? I got a typo. It ain't perfect. What are we going to do? We're going to stop it, and I'm going to change the typo. It's not the end of the world. And many of the things that we believe are the end of the world, aren't actually the end of the world. It's just our belief that they're the end of the world that makes them rise to that level of prominence. So, first I want an example there. So, 3 questions to answer. Consider an activating event that leads to a negative what is the belief that is at the source of that negative consequence or evaluation? So I've given you an example here, but generate your own example. Now, consider the example you used in question 1. How can you change the belief to reduce the impact of the negative catastrophic evaluation? Okay. So now we're going to reframe it. And this is something that Albert Ellis would actually do within a therapeutic setting. So, for example, if I write an assignment that's unclear, all is not lost. I'm not a total failure as a teacher, right? I believe that given the number of new assignments we're creating during the pandemic substantially increases the odds of producing flaws, imperfections that can be corrected upon detection. So see my belief? The previous example is this catastrophizing belief, oh my God, if I mess up, I'm a failure. My belief that I want to replace it with, that is a constructive belief, is, hey, we're under a lot of pressure. Hey, we're good at what we do. And in spite of that, we're going to make mistakes. But when we make mistakes, sometimes you guys point them out to me, and that allows me the opportunity to correct them. Or sometimes I find the mistakes myself. But it's going to happen. And it's not the end of the world. And we will still have an awesome course in spite of making those mistakes. So notice the belief. Man, if it ain't perfect, I'm a failure. Whereas I believe that it's unlikely to be perfect, but we're going to strive to make it as good as possible. And that does not mean that I'm a failure. So note that a mistake with the first belief system, as expressed in number 1, becomes personally devastating. Notice that the same mistake with belief system number 2 becomes an opportunity for improvement, an opportunity to learn, an opportunity to master my craft to a greater and greater extent. The deal is, which way do we want to live? And to what extent does getting mindful about our belief systems and how they affect us allow us to take greater control over our perception of the outcomes? Okay? And then third, I want to shift the emphasis from beliefs about consequences to beliefs about abilities. So now we got the ABC model, but we're going to kind of push out ahead of A in front of A, right? What are 2 beliefs about one's ability that can affect the activating event? So in this case, I've got 20 years of teaching under my belt, and I've got 5 years of training in an industrial setting before I ever began teaching. So one of the beliefs that leads towards that activating event is I have a strong sense of self-efficacy, remember that term, in my ability to transmit information to others in a relatively clear manner. I remember when I was at the paper mill and I was conducting trainings and teaching statistical process control and teaching experimental design, etc. And we would do this in small groups, you know, and my coworkers would say, Mark, you should be a teacher. And I would just laugh them off, you know, because I'm just a mill worker with my high school diploma, you know, but I guess they were right, but now I've experienced it, and now I believe it. So this is a belief that precedes the activating event, right? So what are 2 beliefs then that can lead to the perception of an enhanced personal control and diminished personal control? Right. So a positive and negative belief for this question would be ideal, but 2 positives or 2 negatives are okay. given this is a new assignment that I've never given anyone, I think it's better that we be flexible on this. But let me give you an example of a belief that might precede an activating event for the teaching example. I was talking to one of my coworkers. It was a tenured professor, and we were talking in the bathroom, which is where, often conversations start. And I said, this is really challenging, moving away from the model of lecture, midterm, lecture, midterm, lecture, final, boom, out of there. To now we're developing exercises, activities, and I looked at him and I said, I sometimes wonder if I have the capacity to change to this extent. And he's about my age, and he says, yeah. He says, I think I'm about done. I think my capacity to change is exhausted. Now, that's a belief, right? And that's a belief system. And notice then how that's going to change one's relationship to any activating events within the teaching realm. It's a belief that profound change is necessary, coupled with a belief that, in fact, this person will not be able to make that level of change necessary. So, do with it what you will, and obviously you're going to have to find your own examples, right? So, for my example, my belief I can generate assignments that are interesting, useful, demonstrates a sense of personal control over the outcome consequences of assignment quality. I believe I can do this. I believe that going into the semester, I said, okay, so I got to convert 3 courses to online. We're going to get rid of the midterms, so points are going to be accrued from homework, and I'm going to need anywhere from 10 to 12 assignments per class. Do I have it in me to, over the course of the semester, generate 30 to 40 new assignments? Yeah. I think I can do that, right? So that facilitates my ability. Now, on the other hand, if I believe the demands my bosses are putting on me are unrealistic and unmanageable, I can't see how OSU thinks that this is possible. They're mistreating me. I believe that I need to be treated better and be given more resources and more time. I believe, and notice, that's straight up what Ellis was talking about when he was talking about beliefs about how one should be treated, right? So, then likely to see my sense of personal control diminish, making the creation of shitty assignments more probable. And then that activating event, if I create shitty assignments, creation of shitty assignment is the activating event, and then my belief, oh my God, anyone who creates shitty assignments must be a shitty teacher, right? And then the consequences, so we see how that unfolds. So, in the first 2 questions, we have the ability to look at the beliefs in the B section of Ellis's model. But then I want to take what we've got from the rest of the rest of this lecture, and put it up ahead and address that. Make sense? So that's discussion board 2. Check the date to post it, and no response is necessary. So you're just going to answer these 3 questions. Individual assignment. On the discussion. Okay, a little earlier, I mentioned the idea of wisdom, and I think it's so captured in this quote here. And this is by Reinhold Niebuhr, and this is also the Alcoholics Anonymous prayer. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things that I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. And whether we're talking alloplastic versus autoplastic, whether we're talking problem focus versus emotion focused coping, take your pick. I think it applies to both. Hey, some things maybe I can't change, and I'm better off just recognizing that and not trying to change them, right? But those things that I can change, grant me the courage to be an active agent to demonstrate the personal control and to move forward to change those. But the wisdom is knowing which is which. Okay. So now we talk mastery versus helplessness, and we're going to introduce ourselves to a big man in psychology, positive psychology. We'll be there in a minute. Many of you, if you've taken positive psychology, which is the bomb of a class, you should probably, if you haven't, take it. And if you have taken it, reflect on your time there, right? So, The mastery motivational orientation, right, is a hardy, resistant portrayal of the self during encounters of failure. That is, man, the blows may come, the sticks and stones may be headed my way, but I'm strong, I'm robust, I'm resilient, and I'm going to take whatever the hell they dish out to me, right? Failure feedback can be helpful and constructive information under these circumstances because it doesn't crush me, it doesn't crush my self-concept. I'm able to incorporate failure feedback and up my game as a result of having done so. Now, helpless motivational orientation is a fragile view of the self. So when these sticks and stones come at me, they're going to leave bruises, permanent scars, or literally break my bones, right? The failure feedback then is a sign of personal inadequacy that just elevates my belief that I'm no good, right? So how do we then craft this relationship to failure? Do we make the choice to use it as something from which we can learn, or do we use it as evidence of how we suck, basically? Now, learned helplessness is the creation of Martin Seligman. It's a psychological state that results when an individual expects that life's outcomes are uncontrollable. And it really is, that's what we're talking about, is the loss of a sense of personal control. So when I have no control, then the outcomes will happen, and over time, wouldn't the logical thing to do be then, if I have no control and the outcomes are just going to occur, should I just relinquish control at that point in time? Doesn't that kind of make sense when you think about it? Because why should I beat my head against a brick wall if there's no chance of ever knocking that wall down? It's setting ourselves up for failure feedback, setting ourselves up for further pain, creating unrealistic expectations that will never be realized, right? So my behavior yields outcomes that happen to me, but there is another situation here. There are other uncontrollable influences that are possible as well. So we have to allow for these uncontrollable influences. Now, this is why some of us buy insurance, right? And, you know, you can get basic insurance that says, hey, I'm going to get basic insurance on my car. If I hit someone, I'll be able to pay, you know, if I'm held liable. But how about if someone hits you and they're uninsured, right? So many of us will carry uninsured motorists because my behavior, I can drive carefully and I can minimize the likelihood that I'll get in an accident. But if I'm sitting at a stoplight and someone is, you know, texting on their phone and they don't see that the light has turned red and see that I'm stopped in front of them and they smash into me, that is an uncontrollable influence. And those things do happen in life. Let us not deny that, right? So, a lack of control. Now, Seligman developed an experimental paradigm to demonstrate, right, learned helplessness. And basically what he did, and it's sad because he's using dogs, and what happened was that dogs were alerted by a light that a shock was coming, and dogs were assigned to experimental conditions. The control condition, the dog could in fact escape, right? So the dog had a measure of control. That is, oh, the light came on. That means the shock's just around the corner, because we know dogs can figure that shit out pretty quickly. Pavlovian conditioning, right? But they were allowed an escape, and they took advantage of the escape. The unfortunate condition was the dogs were no escape was available to them. So what did they do? They learned to just simply accept the shocks, right? And for many people, you can think of perhaps in abusive relationships that a learned helplessness develops. I mean, they see the indication that their partner is about to fly off the handle and get violent, but there's nothing, they believe that there's nothing they can do to control that outcome. So they learn to just take it, right? And learned helplessness. So, results of the prototypical learned helplessness study then: inescapable shock, right? Receive the shock, no coping response could terminate the shock. Phase 2, received an escapable shock. Results: failed to escape from the shock. They learned here that they can't do anything, so even when they had an opportunity to, they didn't exercise that opportunity. Now, the escapable shock, right? They receive the shock, pressing the nose against a button could terminate the shock. They receive an escapable shock. They quickly learned to escape the shock by jumping over the barrier. So we see there's also a cross-modality effect. learning to escape or terminate the shock also then allows for other options or different ways of escaping the shock. This is a profound portion of the study that probably isn't emphasized enough, that we can develop a habit of learned helplessness that then reaches into different domains in our life. Or we can learn the habit of personal control, right? And that will then extend to multiple domains in our life. Right? So, 3 components of learned helplessness. Well, contingency, and this is the objective relationship, right, between a person's behavior and the environment's outcomes. So, one element when we want to understand the demonstration of helplessness is what is the contingency at work. Then, what are the cognitions that are at work? Subjective personal control beliefs, and these can come to us in terms of biases, attributions, or expectancies, but, beliefs, and beliefs is the big word. And we can go back to Ellis here. If I believe that I'm incapable of escaping, then that's really going to be the outcome, right? And then what do we see as a resulting behavior of learned helplessness? Listless, demoralized coping behavior. That is just kind of, rolling over and taking it, not standing up for oneself. Right? And we often see that in people. We say, God, you shouldn't let them say that to you. Why don't you stand up for yourself? But we don't know what their history is. They may have learned to be helpless from previous circumstances, and that learned helplessness now applies to the new circumstances. So what are the effects of helplessness? Well, motivational deficits, decreased willingness to try. Why try? Nothing I do matters, right? It just doesn't seem to make any difference. If I do this, it doesn't make any. I do this, it doesn't make any difference. Notice that entering into this type of relationship, my advice is simply do not persist in this type of relationship. If you have a partner that forces you into a world of learned helplessness, God, no matter what I do, they bite my head off. Well, you're just ceding your personal control at this point in time. You might want to reassess your position. Why am I with this person if they simply add misery to my life, right? Now, learning deficits, acquired pessimistic set that interferes with one's ability to learn new response outcome contingencies. Note that the dog jumped over the fence, but this is a dog that was taught to terminate the shock by pressing the button with their nose. We learn new contingencies, we learn new strategies. So maybe we don't get the grade we want to get on an assignment, but we learn from that. And we develop new approaches to completing assignments successfully. We build our toolkit that allows us to persevere and to try new things. And then emotional deficits. So we suffer these energy depleting emotions, apathy, depression, anxiety, listlessness. And note that anxiety can come from anticipation of a situation where learned helplessness will be the outcome. So, from Martin Seligman, psychology should be just as concerned with building strength as with repairing damage. And note, this was the breath of fresh air. Carl Rogers, Abraham Maslow, Martin Seligman came in and said, no, psychology can move us forward. Psychology can make things better. We can be okay and become better. And that's the beauty of positive psychology, was saying this isn't just about repairing psychological pathology. This is also about taking normal functioning and making it awesome functioning. So, explanatory styles. Who are you? Optimistic explanatory style. Do you tend to explain bad events with attributions that are unstable and controllable? So when something bad happens, I say, well, that's not always the way it's going to go down, and I can exert greater control. Right? It's related to self-serving bias, the illusion of control, which contributes to enhancing self-esteem and promoting an optimistic view of the future. The glass is, in fact, half full. Now, the pessimistic explanatory style, tendency to explain bad events with attributions that are stable and uncontrollable. No matter what I do, I can't make anything change in this regard. Notice, it's stable and it's uncontrollable. Associated with academic failure, social distress, impaired job performance, and depression. So, I think enough for me. Let us then listen to Seligman in his own words.
Psychologists told us a lot about misery and suffering and drug addiction and schizophrenia, but there's a way in which that's just half-baked. I mean, full-baked, what we want to know is what makes life worth living. How about positive emotion? How about meaning? How about spirituality? How about gratitude? How about accomplishment? So the intellectual idea was for psychology to have make full sense of the human condition. In many circumstances, the data are that optimistic people get depressed at only half the rate when setbacks occur, that optimistic people do better than expected on the sports field, in grades, and in many kinds of work, that optimistic people have yeastier immune systems, they're less likely to die of cardiovascular disease, and that descriptively optimistic people are generally liked better. It turns out if you take pessimistic people, depressive people, of which I'm an example, and you teach them principles of recognizing the catastrophic thoughts they're saying to themselves, this interview is going terribly, I've really lost my touch, and then arguing against it, no, Joe's been laughing and smiling at my jokes throughout, then it turns out you can make people permanently, lastingly more optimistic. The last evolutionary epoch was the Ice Ages, and the mentality that said, it's a lovely day in Philadelphia today, it'll probably be a lovely day tomorrow, got crushed by the ice. And the mentality that was catastrophizing, looks like a lovely day in Philadelphia today, but this is just superficial, and what's really coming in catastrophe is what our intellectual evolutionary forebears, the ones that survived, gave us. So we're bad weather animals, ready to see the most catastrophic. Now, that's very adaptive if you're in Bosnia during a war, or if you're living in a society in which there's death and famine and plague. One of my colleagues, Felicia Huppert, has done a massive survey of the 23 European Union nations. And she asked the question, in each of these 23 nations, what percentage of adults are flourishing? The criteria for flourishing are high amount of positive emotion, good relationships, high amount of meaning in life, high amount of engagement at work. And by those criteria, involving at least 2,000 people in every nation, 32% of Danes are flourishing, 15% of Brits are flourishing, only 5% of Russians are flourishing. What is positive psychology and well-being's long-term goal? Well, I call it 51. It is the notion that by these criteria of high positive emotion, high engagement, high meaning, good relationships, that in the year 2051, 51% of the world's population will be flourishing. Now, that's a grandiose dream, and I don't know how it will happen, but we've now been able to define the notion of flourishing. We know quite a bit about what increases positive emotion, engagement, meaning, and I think it's a great vision for the future of my science and my discipline to be part of a movement that creates vastly more flourishing around the world.
All right, psychologists, can we do it? Can we create a world where an ever-increasing number of people are flourishing? And this is where I believe that competition is a myth. The idea that it's survival of the fittest, that we need to win at the expense of someone else, we need to beat this country, or we need to beat this group of people within our country, doesn't serve us well. It's something that we've done throughout human history, and what it does is it always elevates one group at the expense of another. Are we bright enough? Do we care enough? Are we flexible and creative enough that we can create an environment where an ever-increasing number of people flourish, as Seligman is suggesting? And to me, this is probably the most important aspect of my spending time with you in this domain of education. Because to the extent that I can present this toolkit of behaviors, of processes, this system of ideas that support personal flourishing, the flourishing of our family, the flourishing of our workplace, and the flourishing of our community, to the extent that we can work together in this, then there's tremendous potential for everyone on the planet. But for those who want to slice and dice us, who want to balkanize us, to put us in this group, conservative versus liberal, right? And what's the most important thing? Oh, that we own the libs. And what the hell does that mean? I mean, what's important is what policies are we going to adopt to advance the human agenda in a way that benefits the most people possible, right? So it's this mindset that Seligman and so many others are describing that is so enticing for some of us, and what has continued to cause us to want to be educators in this regard is to present an optimistic possibility for the world. Now, these ideas are not without their criticism or alternative explanations, right? When we talk about learned helplessness, traumatic events themselves could induce helplessness. Right? And maybe it's not a belief system that's at work there. Maybe it's just the events themselves. Right? The expectation of failure induces helplessness. Right? Uncontrollable events induce helplessness deficits not because they're uncontrollable, but because they're unpredictable. And that one maybe carries the most weight because human beings are not really good with unpredictable outcomes. Right? But alternative explanations is that people are not motivated to be active, as we've discussed throughout the course, but people are actually motivated to be passive. And I'm going to give these. Obviously, I'm probably not on board with them, right? And helplessness might fundamentally be a physiological rather than a cognitive phenomenon. And, I would counter that one with the line between physiology and cognition is becoming increasingly blurry the more we learn. And thank you to the neuroscientists especially who are illuminating us to those phenomenon. Couple more as we close out here. Reactance theory is the psychological behavioral attempt at reestablishing or reacting against an eliminated or threatened freedom. So when our freedom is threatened, for some of us, we immediately react to try and increase our level of freedom. So let's talk about an experiment. I think it's a pretty funny experiment. This is not the actual wall, but there was a wall next to a high school, and this wall was always tagged with graffiti. Massive amounts of graffiti, so, the school officials then go and they paint over the wall, and then, within a week, right, it's re-tagged, it's got just as much graffiti as it did beforehand. That's not the story. The story is that some researcher who wanted to study reactance theory thought, what an ideal field study, what an ideal location for this study. So they paint over the wall one week, and then they put a sign on there, and it says, under no circumstances is anything to be drawn on this wall. And now they can actually take a photograph of the wall after a week's time with the amount of graffiti and note that they can actually subject it to a computer analysis and say what proportion of the wall is now covered. Isn't that cool? Because you can get a numeric evaluation of the amount of coverage. Now, the experimental condition, right, is the next week they put over the wall, they put a sign, please don't write on the wall. And then they can assess how much graffiti was put that week. And what do you think? Which condition generated the least amount of graffiti? The please don't. So when we bring people in as partners via a request, we're more likely to get cooperation. When we become heavy-handed and say don't do this, we set the stage for reactance to take place. Right? Now, let's combine reactance and helplessness. And what we see here, tough, so the exposure to uncontrollable outcome, right? And we know that controllability is one of the variables that we've been discussing, and motivation to exert control. And what we find is that as we increase the uncontrollability of the outcome, and it's a high importance outcome, we see that helplessness, right, actually increases. When it's a low importance outcome, we see that helplessness doesn't decrease to the same extent. So it's kind of this irony that in high stakes situations, helplessness can even be more profoundly felt, right? So now, when we see that there's a level of controllability, and that would be in this area of the graph, we see then when uncontrollability is low, then we see reactance as becoming higher, right? So let's put it all together. So hope, and again, nice little lecturette in Psych of Emotion on hope. Got one on courage, right? So, but hope, agentic thinking, the performer's perceived capacity to accomplish the goals, I can do this. So self-efficacy is one of the components of hope. Pathways thinking. Pathways thinking is a wonderful concept that I believe there is a route or a path to where I want to go. It's a performer's belief that he can generate multiple viable routes to desired goals. I will find a way to get this done. So I've got efficacy, the self-efficacy belief, I can do this, and I believe that I can find a way to get it done. So I have the ability, and the route is available to me to exercise that ability. Put those two components together, and hope is realized, right? And we remember President Obama's book before he ran for office, or as he was running for office, The Audacity of Hope. And I remember reading Obama's book, and I said, this sounds great. I mean, if it's real, all the more awesome, right? But it is the audacity of hope. It's the audacity to believe that we can, and the audacity to believe that there is a path to get there. And through those two, hope then becomes realized. And it's about personal control. So it's about belief systems, it's about personal control, it's about unlearning helplessness if that's something we've learned, it's about building our self-efficacy through honest evaluation allows us hope. And allows us then, hope is akin to optimism, is it not? That we can do this, that this will work out, right? So, there you go. That was Lecture 9 in its entirety. As always, I hope you enjoyed, and let's say goodbye for today. And Montana is chilling out, and maybe some of us are thinking about chilling out as we approach the weekend. So I hope you have a great evening, a great weekend, depending on when you actually happen to watch this. For me, weekend's in mind because today is Friday, but obviously you could be watching this, you're definitely watching it on a different day than today. So you guys have a great day. Take care.